turn now to First Minister's questions. First question from Jackson Carlo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This morning, the Health Committee heard from Professor Hugh Pennington. He suggested that in a care home, for every one person with the virus, 10 to 14 other people can become infected, compared to 0.6 to one additional person now becoming infected outside of a care home. Professor Pennington called for routine testing of care home workers, and earlier today the First Minister said more or less the Scottish Government is looking at it, that it is always under review. First Minister, care homes and families would appreciate more of a sense of urgency. What are the Scottish Government's specific plans for testing all care home staff, and for the testing of care home staff to then become routine?
First Minister.
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to look in detail at Professor Pennington's evidence to the Health Committee this morning. I'll, of course, do that when I'm able to. I don't know what he has based that assessment on. The question was put to me at the Daily Update earlier on that he'd said the R number in care homes, in his view, was 10. I said last week that we think, based on the best estimate we can have at this stage, that in the community it's between 0.6 and 1, and it is undoubtedly higher than that in care homes right now, but I do not know where the 10 comes from. It's certainly not based on any evidence or advice that I have had. In terms of care homes, we obviously take the situation in care homes very seriously and do treat it as a matter of urgency in all of its different respects and aspects. There has been very clear guidance in place for care homes from very early on in this epidemic, which care home providers have a responsibility to ensure is implemented in full. We've enhanced the clinical leadership around care homes and given particular responsibility to public health directors. Obviously, the Care Inspectorate, working with local health protection teams, has a key role there. On testing, we have been expanding our testing in line with what we consider to be the best clinical approach. Also, obviously, as we expand the capacity to test, we have a situation right now where symptomatic residents in care homes should be tested. All of those being admitted to care homes should be tested, and care home workers who are off or who are isolating also have access to testing. We know health and care workers, and where appropriate their families. So far there's been more than 20,000 of those tested. It's around 30% of those will be care home workers or their families. So we will continue to take measured decisions around extending that further. One of the issues that is where the evidence around this virus is currently developing is in asymptomatic people and the likelihood or ability of them to transmit the virus. At an earlier stage, I think the balance of judgment was that that wasn't likely. That is changing, so we are taking account of that in the decisions we're taking around testing. This morning we've announced that all patients over 70 being admitted to hospital will now be tested on admission, and then at a period of every 4 days during their stay. So these are things that we continue to have under daily review, but will be guided in these decisions by the best possible evidence, and making sure that as we are expanding testing, we are doing that for soundly based reasons.
Jackson Carlo. Thank the First Minister. I mean, obviously, as it becomes appreciated widely within the public that there is a higher infection and death rate within care homes, this is difficult to underestimate the level of concern that this has both for residents and for their families. And there are additional issues facing care homes. The National Records of Scotland publish weekly figures and is due to do so again tomorrow. There are reports that care home residents who died of COVID-19 have not appeared as yet in those official figures because the NRS only includes those with COVID-19 specifically identified on the death certificate. The Care Inspectorate, on the other hand, does record this data. First Minister, this is a sensitive subject, but good information is vital. So, Presiding Officer, can the First Minister clarify, does the Care Inspectorate give the Scottish Government these wider figures? And if so, will she publish them?
First Minister.
We will continue to publish and I'll come back to this point because I think there is a fear here that there is an under-reporting of deaths, and the explanation I'll give in a second should give some reassurance around that. But I hope people will understand that the correct and the robust basis for reporting deaths associated with COVID-19 is a test and or the entry on a death certificate. Anything beyond that would not be soundly based in terms of that connection between somebody's death and the virus. The figures that are now published weekly, which will be published in their latest form tomorrow, in this respect, they are figures published by date of death registration, although there is also some information published in these reports about figures by date of death. But these are the most up-to-date figures in this respect of any country in the UK. As I understand it, they are a week more up-to-date than the equivalent ONS figures that were published for England and Wales this morning. Now, the bit I want to give some reassurance about is because these figures, as I'm sure all members look at them very closely, they give the total number of deaths for the week in question. And then they compare that to the average number of deaths in the similar week for the previous 5 years. And so the excess number of deaths, and in the last couple of weeks, the number of deaths has been above the average for the last 5 years. And it will set out how many of those are attributable to the virus. And if there is a remaining number of deaths that are not attributable in that way, but that is the number of excess deaths, and NRS are also providing some further explanation around that. So that publication gives the total number of deaths and as much breakdown as NRS are able to do. So this fear that there is lurking somewhere some unreported number of deaths does not have that basis in fact. And I think that report, NRS have made clear that excess deaths that are not attributable to COVID through death certificate reporting merits much further exploration, and it's a phenomenon that we are seeing in countries across the world right now. In last week's report, they were able to give some further context for that. I don't know whether they'll be able to do more of that tomorrow, but I hope that report, given the comprehensive nature of it, allays any sense that there's some hidden number of deaths associated with this virus.
Jackson Carver.
I think the First Minister will appreciate, even from our answer, it's a very complicated subject, and we'll study that answer with care, and I hope it does give the reassurance that she suggests. One of the absolute priorities in tackling COVID-19 has to be clarity, so I turn to the new guidance from the Scottish Government on face coverings. This new guidance is clear about the limits to face covering, where they might be effective and where they are not. But we haven't been told exactly what the evidence the First Minister has been using to inform today's change in advice. So for the sake of absolute clarity, can the First Minister confirm if this new advice came from SAGE, from the CMO for Scotland, from both or from elsewhere? And can she be absolutely clear in which circumstances she is recommending face coverings be used, given that this is already being reported as a requirement for all Scots to wear face coverings when leaving home, which I know is not the intention she was seeking to convey earlier today?
First Minister.
SAGE has given advice. I've looked at the evidence that has come through the SAGE process. I understand ministers and other governments are doing likewise, but also I have discussed the matter with the Chief Medical Officer, as members I'm sure would expect me to do. One of the reasons I thought it was important to give guidance is, yes, to say to people that there is now evidence, and the evidence is not overwhelming, but there is evidence now that I have seen that there could be some benefit in a situation where somebody has the virus but is asymptomatic and may be shedding that virus but doesn't know they have it because they don't have symptoms, that may give some additional protection against them transmitting the virus to others. So given that there is that indication of some benefit there, I think it's important people know that. But the other reason is because I don't want people, and anecdotally, I see it, I'm sure all of us are seeing it, that many people are choosing to do this anyway. And a concern I have is that people are thinking it gives more protection than it actually does, and that people have some kind of invincibility if they're covering their face to being infected with this virus. So the rationale for the guidance is to set out what the limited benefit may be, but also to say, look, this is not a substitute for the other things that people should be doing. If anything, it is an added protection, and you should do this as an added precaution. But the most important things are to keep doing the stay at home, isolating in certain circumstances, and not mixing outside your own household, and following all the hand hygiene and other hygiene rules. In terms of the circumstances, we're not making this mandatory right now. This is advice and a recommendation. And effectively, the advice is, if you are leaving your own home, to go into an enclosed space where you will be with other people and it will be difficult to keep the recommended 2 metres social distancing, then those are the circumstances in which you should wear a face covering, and I stress covering, not medical mask. Now, what I would also say is the circumstances in which people should be in these situations right now should be very limited if you're following the stay-at-home guidance. So the examples we've given today are people going to essential work and on public transport, or people going to a supermarket for food shopping, or perhaps a smaller food shop where social distancing is more difficult. So those are the examples we've given. We will keep this under review. As and when, and we're not here yet, let me stress, we are easing any of these restrictions and people are perhaps interacting with other people more often, then there may be a need to widen or extend that advice to other circumstances. But if you're going to an enclosed space where you are coming into contact with other people and you're worried that you're not able to keep the social distance, those are the circumstances in which wearing a face covering, which I stress is a scarf or a bandana, a cloth, piece of cloth or other textile, not medical masks, which we're not advising the general public that they have to wear.
Jackson Carlo.
It was, First Minister, that distinction between smaller convenience stores and larger supermarkets that I've had some emails since the announcement at lunchtime, where one rather charmingly pointed out that in a large supermarket they would be no nearer anybody else than I am to you just now, and pointed out that, will I be wearing a face mask this afternoon in consequence, this being an enclosed space. So I do think it's a difficult distinction for some people to understand, and it would be helpful just to have clarity of your thinking on that. But finally, is it possible this week that we may soon be moving into the next phase in our response to coronavirus? We can't be complacent, we still have a long way to go. And there was a reminder this morning that even as we continue to confront the health emergency, the economic challenge is also huge, particularly for Scotland. The Press and Journal reports that 30,000 jobs could be lost in oil and gas. And in recent years, the UK government's delivered billions of pounds worth of support for the North East, transferable tax history, slashing the supplementary charge, investing in carbon capture and decommissioning. Last week, the First Minister said she would consider support for the North East. So, Presiding Officer, ministers having had that opportunity to consider what could be done, can she confirm to those in this vital sector worried about their jobs, their families and the wider industry, with redundancies being confirmed as we speak, regrettably, what action the Scottish Government may now take?
First Minister.
We'll continue to consider that. We haven't come to final decisions. We'll continue to discuss with the sector. I would point out that most of the levers around oil and gas, certainly in terms of the fiscal regime there, lie with the UK Government. So perhaps the most important discussion we have to have is with the UK Government, who have, I may say, been very forthcoming in support for businesses. So I hope that will be a productive discussion. But we will continue to take whatever decisions we can to give maximum support to the economy and different sectors within the economy. I am acutely aware of the economic impact, and a negative economic impact of this magnitude, of course, then feeds into social and health impacts as well. We are dealing with a number of different interrelated harms right now, which we have to manage in a way to try to reduce the overall harm that is done to the population. In terms of going into a new phase, it's important that we take decisions at the right time and not prematurely. Obviously, from a health perspective, the worst thing we could do would be to prematurely lift restrictions and then allow the virus to run out of control again. But actually, that would be really damaging to the economy and to businesses as well. This is not a trade-off. This is about trying to balance all of these things together. The next review date of the current lockdown measures, of course, is the 7th of May. I would say at this stage there is no guarantee whatsoever that come the 7th of May we will be in a position to be able to lift any of these measures, although we are, as I set out last week, going through a process of assessing different options and taking the advice on what the impact would be. We must continue to suppress this virus. The margins that we are operating within are very narrow right now. The difference between an R number of 0.6, 0.7 and 0.8, 0.9 is quite dramatic in terms of what you would start to see with spread of the virus. So we have to be very careful. This is not, as I've said before, a flick of the switch moment. Some of the restrictions we are living with right now in terms of social distancing are likely to be with us for a considerable time to come until we have a vaccine or treatment. So we will take these decisions cautiously, we will take them carefully, and we will take them in a way that best balances these different factors that we have to take into account. And of course we will keep Parliament advised and updated as we go.
Thank you very much. I'll just highlight we have a sizable number of members who wish to ask questions. So concise questions, concise answers. Please, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by reminding members of my register of interests. Today is International Workers' Memorial Day, and each year on this day we gather to mourn those who have died at work, to remember the dead, and to fight for the living. With so many key workers in Scotland fighting this pandemic, this has never been more important than it is today. So will the First Minister mark International Workers' Memorial Day and agree with GMB Scotland that there should be a fatal accident inquiry for every health and social care worker who dies from COVID-19? And will she also mark it by extending the death in service payment for NHS workers that has been announced to Scotland's care workers?
First Minister.
Like I'm sure all of us, marked International Workers' Memorial Day at 11 AM this morning by taking part in a minute's silence, but I will also mark it not just today but every single day in doing everything I possibly can to make sure key workers, not exclusively but in particular those working in our health and social care sectors, have the protections that they need in whatever form and respect that they need them. In terms of the two specific points, the Health Secretary has already written to the Health Committee to say that we will set out details of death and service arrangements by the end of this week, by the 1st of May. The reason we are taking a bit of time is because we're talking to trade unions about that to make sure there is agreement around those arrangements, but we have always made clear that we will put arrangements of that nature in place, and it's right and proper that we do so. In terms of the question about fatal accident inquiry, as Richard Leonard I know understands, the question of whether or not to instruct fatal accident inquiries in Scotland is not one for ministers, it is one for law officers acting independently of ministers. The Lord Advocate issued a statement at the end of last week making clear his responsibilities in this regard. All of us will want to make sure that the right thing is done by any frontline worker who dies through protecting the rest of us from this virus in whatever shape that takes. But it's important that we understand the processes so that these things happen in a way that is right and proper. But I'm sure we'll discuss issues like that in the future. But my focus right now on an ongoing basis is to make sure that those on the front line of dealing with this pandemic have the protections that they need.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. And let me turn to that point, because throughout this pandemic there has all too often been a gap and a time lag between what the Scottish Government announces and what is actually being delivered on the ground. And let me return to residential care homes. Families across the country are deeply concerned about the situation in our care homes. And I speak from personal experience. On Friday last week, I lost my own uncle to COVID-19. He was living in a care home. The Scottish Government's framework document published last week said that the government listened to the advice of bodies like the World Health Organization. But they say test, 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 and there has been little testing of care workers. The government also said in that document that it listened to bodies like the European Union's Centre for Disease Control. But they have said, and I quote, staff in long-term care facilities should be tested on a regular basis, twice weekly. And we know that is simply not happening. So when the First Minister talks about expanding testing, can she tell us how many care home residents and care home workers have actually been tested in Scotland? And First Minister, are you confident that the government has done everything it could to prevent the devastating losses we are seeing in Scotland's care homes?
First Minister.
Firstly, let me convey my condolences to Richard Leonard for his personal loss. I think one of the difficult things for all of us in dealing with this is the impact that this virus is having means there are probably now very few of us who, either through our own families or friends or wider networks, don't know somebody who has been affected in some way, and I think we all understand that impact. In terms of I spend, as the Health Secretary does, as ministers do, each and every day right now, trying to make sure we are doing everything we can on an ongoing basis to protect those on the front line and to protect residents in care homes. What I'm about to say should not in any way be seen as me underplaying the situation in care homes, because I would not want to do that in any way. But what we are seeing in terms of the number of overall deaths from this virus in care homes in Scotland is broadly in line with some of the international evidence, which tells us that care homes, well, firstly, older people are particularly vulnerable to becoming ill and dying from this virus, and that is not just older people in care homes. The vast majority of deaths overall have been in the over 65 age group, and they will be in a variety of different locations. But care homes, institutional settings generally, this virus spreads more quickly, which is why we are taking the steps that I have already outlined. I've already outlined to Jackson Carlos, the approach we're taking to testing, keeping all of these things under review and expanding testing as we go, as our capacity increases, but also on a basis that we have sound clinical reasons for doing that. In terms of the numbers, we will set out at the end of this week, which of course is also the end of the month, where we are in terms of capacity for testing and the numbers of tests that we are doing on a daily basis, which now comes not just from the numbers that we report every day right now, but we will shortly be adding into that the numbers that are being tested through the drive-through centres in several locations across the country, and that will give us more detail of total numbers. In terms of the number of care home staff, or where appropriate their families, because that is important. I have already indicated that number. The total number of health and care staff that have now been tested, or their families where appropriate, is 20,700 or thereabouts, and just under 30% of that is care staff or their families. That number continues to increase, and it has increased by a higher number in each of the last few weeks, and will continue to do so.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you, but that's still considerably less than 1 in 5 of all care home staff who are employed in Scotland. Last Thursday, the First Minister announced that the Scottish Government would be adopting a test, trace and isolate strategy, and we welcome that. And in their framework document, they set out early and rapid testing, early and effective tracing, and early and sustained isolation of contacts. Professor Devry Sidrar, a member of the Scottish Government's own advisory group, has suggested that such a strategy could require between 15 and 20,000 tests per day. And yet, we are still not even meeting the Scottish Government's own target of 3,500 tests per day. And in fact, whilst the Health Secretary announced 6 weeks ago that there would be an increase in community testing, the Interim Chief Medical Officer has since made clear that it would only start this week, which is neither early nor rapid. First Minister, do you recognise that the number of daily tests suggested by Professor Sridhar is the right number? And when will your government realistically be in a position to implement such a test and trace strategy?
First Minister.
Well, I think it's important we don't mix up different things here. So let me talk not so much about the testing we're doing now for the purposes right now, but look ahead to the test, trace, isolate. That work is underway already. Yes, broadly, I think the numbers I do recognise. So there are assessments we need to make about numbers of tests. There are assessments we need to make and are making these assessments about the number of contact tracers, and that work is underway. These things depend on how low you get the prevalence of the virus right now, which is why we need to get it as low. One of the reasons why we need to get it as low as possible, because that then determines the numbers of people that are likely to be symptomatic and need testing, and your assessments about the number of contact tracers depend to some extent on the extent of social distancing you still have in place, because that obviously determines the number of contacts that each of us has on a daily basis. The Health Secretary and I took part in another in-depth session about this yesterday to look at where that work has got to. I want and I intend that probably early next week we will publish a more detailed paper on test, trace, isolate, because I think it's important people really understand where it fits into the overall approach in the next phase, the work that we are doing and the capacity we need to build to, but also that the public start to develop an understanding of their role in making a test, trace, isolate system work, because it depends on the public recognising symptoms, doing what they need to do, and also the public being prepared for periods of isolation that may be multiple periods of isolation depending on who they've been in contact with. So this work is is underway, and as I say, we will publish something more detailed early next week, both to explain how that kind of approach works and the work we are doing in order to get to the capacity to deliver it. We are working to have a capacity in place within weeks in order to start to dovetail with how restrictions may start to be eased, but of course the capacity you need will develop over time depending on the degree of social distancing that is still in place. You're going to have, you know, all of us have many fewer contacts now than we would do if we were living life normally, and so there will be stages in between these two places that will determine the capacity we need to have. It's complicated work, but I would give members an assurance that the work is well underway within the Scottish Government, and we will, as I say, provide further detail soon.
Question number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. On this International Workers' Memorial Day, the Scottish Greens pay tribute to the essential workers who have sadly lost their lives fighting COVID-19. It is the heaviest price to pay, and the safety of their peers is paramount at this time. On Friday, I published a proposal to routinely test health and care workers whether they have symptoms or not. This proposal has been welcomed by experts and organisations, including the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. Routine testing for hospital workers and carers, whether they are showing symptoms or not, will help detect cases early, it will reduce the spread of this virus, and it will give these dedicated workers the extra protection that they deserve. So will the First Minister commit to routine testing for hospital workers and carers, not only those with symptoms?
First Minister.
I think the comments I've already made about the basis on which we are taking decisions about the expansion of testing apply in relation to the answer I would give to that question. There's two other points I would make which are not designed to diminish the importance of testing, but I think it is really important that we always have that in context. Firstly, although the evidence around people transmitting the virus while asymptomatic is developing, we're still not confident that this test is 100% reliable before people have symptoms. And I think that is a really important contextual point so that we don't have an over-reliance on testing, but instead see it in its proper context. The second point, which flows from that, is that, you know, whether or not we test particular groups, I mean, going back to the point about care homes, the most important thing in a care home, and this will be true in a hospital as well, are the infection prevention and control policies and procedures that are in place. These are the most important things in how we make sure we're trying in these institutional settings to stop the virus entering them and then spreading. So testing, yes, has a part to play as we continue to increase our capacity, we continue to expand the categories of people we test, but we've always got to bear in mind that we are still not in a position where we can be sure that test is 100% reliable in cases of people who do not have symptoms of the virus.
Alison Johnson.
Thank the First Minister for her response. I spoke to a notable Scottish expert on the issue of the test and just how effective it was, and their response to me was that we must not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. To properly protect the people of Scotland, we need a comprehensive test, trace and isolate strategy. Routine testing of carers and hospital workers has to be part of this. One major hospital in London is already carrying out routine testing of asymptomatic workers. Adding to the growing body of evidence in support of such action, a study just published by Imperial College London advises that regular testing, irrespective of symptoms, could prevent about a third of transmission from those who are tested. Commenting on our proposal, respiratory consultant and expert Professor James Chalmers said, "The data is coming fast. Asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic healthcare workers are likely to be transmitting to other staff and vulnerable patients. We will regret the lost time if we don't move to address this now. The urgency is clear if we're to prevent deaths and protect our workers. Every day where asymptomatic workers go untested increases risk. We can act to avoid this. So can the First Minister please confirm that she will act now?"
First Minister.
We will continue to increase our testing capacity and expand the categories we test based on the best evidence. I read a lot of expert evidence on this every day. I take a lot of advice from experts. as with politicians, some experts disagree on some of the detail of this, but we need to continue to inform our views with the best advice and expertise that we have available. It is not the case at any stage that we are allowing perfect to become the enemy of good. We've already announced today an extension of testing into a group of people regardless of whether they've got symptoms. But equally, we've got to guard against testing asymptomatic people becoming false assurance. If somebody who is asymptomatic tests negative, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have the virus. So we have to balance a lot of things here. And I would also just caution against, although there is clearly a relationship and a bridge between the two, but caution against mixing up what we are doing now and the purposes for which we are using our expanding testing capacity with what we move to as we go further into the test, trace, isolate approach.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
Last week I asked the First Minister to support a positive proposal to pay £29 per day extra to health and social care workers. Would the First Minister be able to update us on whether she's made any progress on that proposal? This pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of the social care sector. Low wages and precarious contracts, even though they are caring for the most vulnerable in society. And morale at this time is particularly low. So will the First Minister also agree to review pay and conditions for all social care staff, whether in care homes or care at home, so we can give this sector the status and the support that it desperately needs?
First Minister.
We've not yet come to a final view on the proposal that Willie Rennie raised last week. I'm sure he will appreciate there is a lot of issues and demands that we are working through. That's not to say any of them are less important than others, but we need to make sure that we are prioritising issues that are urgent and pressing in terms of a staffing issue. The one that has already been raised about death in service is one that the Health Secretary has been prioritising, seeking to resolve. So all of these issues are important, but we require to work through them properly so that we come to considered views and come to the right conclusions on things. I think we will be looking for quite some time to come about how we properly recognise and reward those on the front line of our health and care services, but also thinking much more fundamentally. Lots of what we've been talking around the care sector right now raise real questions in my mind about the future in terms of how we deliver social care in Scotland. When it comes to paying conditions, there are well-established arrangements in place through staff-side discussions about how we do that, and we will continue to discuss these issues in the normal way. But I think some of the issues that Willie Rennie is raising, I know some of them have short-term and immediate aspects to them, but some of these issues raise much more fundamental questions that I think it would be right for all of us, not just the government, but as a parliament, to think through properly and carefully, learning from the experience we've had in the last few weeks along the way.
Willie Rennie.
I do understand the capacity of government to be able to take on new issues and new plans, but I think it is important, as the First Minister says, because morale is particularly low in the sector just now. So if we are able to give an early indication that this would be possible at some point, that would help immensely. There are also gaps in the financial support available from the Scottish and UK governments, which is leaving some people and companies in great difficulty. These gaps are going to continue if we only use the existing tax and spending architecture. Would it not make sense, at least for the length of this pandemic, to use some form of universal basic income to deal with this problem? The Spanish government are now bringing it in. Will the First Minister raise it with the Prime Minister this week so we can implement at this next stage of the pandemic economic response?
First Minister.
I'm on record as being, previously as being very interested in universal basic income, and I think the experience of this pandemic and the impacts of dealing with it make the case for that stronger than ever. So I certainly want to see that seriously considered as an option. I don't want to stray into political or constitutional territory right now, but I really wish we had the totality of powers in this Parliament where we could move ahead with something that right now, but of course with welfare still largely reserved, we would need to do that in cooperation and collaboration with the UK Government. So yes, I will raise it with the UK Government and continue to do so. In terms of gaps in the support, we continually look at where there are gaps and try to plug them as much as possible within the financial constraints we have, and we have discussions with the UK Government on an ongoing basis about how some of those gaps can be filled by them working in partnership with us. So those conversations will certainly continue.
Thank you very much. Move to some supplementary questions. The first from Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Brian Whittle. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Indeed, the vital importance of the care sector has never been more evident. Can I ask the First Minister, therefore, what discussions the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government on migration policy in light of the increasing demand on the care sector in Scotland?
First Minister.
I think that's an important point. I think this current crisis has very clearly demonstrated our reliance on individuals in our health and care sectors and on key workers across our communities, and many of them were not born in this country, but they have chosen to make their homes here. So we have called on the UK Government to grant all migrants leave to remain during this time and to longer term revisit their approach to immigration policy. I also think we should, all of us across society, stop using the inaccurate and somewhat demeaning terminology of lower skilled to describe the contributions of key workers. These are vital roles filled by dedicated people with very valuable skills. So we will continue to seek opportunities to discuss these issues with the UK Government and seek to persuade them to have a better approach to immigration coming out of this crisis than perhaps was the case going into it.
Brian Whittle, to be followed by Claire Baker. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I think that there seems to be some confusion on who should have priority for food deliveries from supermarkets. If I can use a constituent of mine as an example here, in her 70s, and who is self-isolating as per government guidelines with her spouse, called the helpline, was called back by 5 different people, all of whom tried to be helpful. 3 said they were eligible, 2 said they weren't. So can I ask the First Minister to clarify, please, the Scottish Government policy on who should be eligible for this scheme, because I'm sure the First Minister would agree with me that consistent messaging is crucial.
First Minister.
Well, let me set out the Scottish Government policy and approach here, but some of the issues that Brian Whittle raises will be down to the capacity of supermarkets to deliver home shopping. And that's not a criticism of them, but the demand on them for these slots is greater than ever. So if I can explain the arrangements in place for what we call the shielded group. Right now, everybody in the shielded group can register through our text message service. So far, 81,000 people have done so. They can, through that, request a food package to be delivered, not by a supermarket, but through the arrangements we have in place. And that is a food package that will be delivered free of charge. So far, over 103,000 of these free food packages have been delivered to people in the shielded group. But we also give people in the shielded group the opportunity to ask us to pass on their details to supermarkets in order that they can be prioritised for delivery slots. And so far, over 34,000 people have asked us to do that, and their data has been passed on to participating supermarkets. We're also currently, I believe, in Scotland, unique in the UK in that those people within that group who weren't already existing customers of supermarkets have now been matched with supermarkets, and I think the rest of the UK are only now doing that. Over and above that, we've put in place a helpline for other vulnerable people who are not in that shielded group. We cannot guarantee supermarket slots for them because that is down to the capacity of supermarkets to deliver that, but we wanted to put that helpline in place so that through local arrangements, if somebody was in need of food or medicines or any other vital support, local resilience partnerships could look at how that is delivered. And I'll take the opportunity to tell people what that national phone line number is, 0800 111 4000. So anybody who is vulnerable and can't access, and we've suggested that that may be people who get the flu jab annually, but anybody who with a vulnerability who needs support, if they phone that number, they're put onto arrangements in their local council area.
Claire Baker, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that the Polish presidential election is still due to take place on the 10th of May.
While I would not ask the First Minister to comment on Poland's politics or the election, can the First Minister provide any assurances to Polish nationals who are resident in Scotland, who have a right to participate in this election if they wish to, that protecting them from the risk of coronavirus will be our priority, and that the Scottish Government will ensure close contact with the Polish consulate on advice for this electorate?
First Minister.
Yes, we will certainly do that. I'm happy to arrange for a written response to be provided to Claire Baker on exactly. Graham Day has given me an indication here that that work is already underway. Obviously, as Claire Baker indicated, of my many responsibilities, the Polish presidential election is not one of them. But nevertheless, the importance of ensuring that Polish residents here have the opportunity to participate in their election is an important matter. So I'll arrange for a written response to be sent to set out what we're doing to ensure that that is the case.
John Mason, to be followed by Jamie Green. John Mason.
Thank you very much. I think the First Minister will agree that sometimes we have a workplace where the management thinks there is sufficient social distancing in place and the unions and the workers feel there is not. Can she say anything about how the Health and Safety Executive have a role in this and what they can do to kind of mitigate or make an agreement at the end?
First Minister.
Well, the Health and Safety Executive, alongside local authorities and of course the police, where there is an issue of enforcement, has a role to play in making sure that employers are complying with the law and also with guidance that is in place. We try to have a close engagement with employers, businesses, sectors of the economy and of course the business organisations to provide as much advice and support as possible. In my experience, I think the vast majority of businesses and employers are trying to do the right thing by their workers and they should be, but where there are concerns we will try to do what we can to help resolve them, and yes, the Health and Safety Executive has a role to play there where required.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Ian Gray. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister if the postponed release of the much-needed and crucially important OECD review of curriculum for excellence could be published, if feasible, before May 2021 rather than after?
First Minister.
Well, I know the Deputy First Minister has given some information of that. Yes, if that proves to be possible and there's a way of doing that, we would want, as a standing principle, for that to be the case. But you know, I really hope members will understand that across a whole range of our responsibilities right now, the focus of the Scottish Government has to be on dealing with the immediate crisis here and then with the various impacts and recovery from this. And that unavoidably has an impact on other business. We will, as we go through this, try to minimise that impact as much as possible and ensure that where things can happen earlier, even earlier than right now we might think is the case, then we will keep these things under review.
Ian Gray, to be followed by Bruce Crawford. Ian Gray.
Thank you. Teachers have worked miracles to move learning into the home, but can the First Minister explain why pupils in some parts of Scotland are offered access to live video teaching while others are not? And will she ensure that Education Scotland provides the national leadership to ensure some consistency, at least, in homeschooling across the country?
First Minister.
Well, I'll certainly take the point back around Education Scotland, but I know there has been some suggestion that Education Scotland has instructed councils not to use video conferencing. That is not the case. Local authorities are responsible for decisions regarding data protection and online safety, and we know that some are considering how and whether to use alternative video conference services out with Glow. Highland and Aberdeen City Councils, I understand, are using Google in some schools. Western Isles Council is using VScene to communicate with pupils. But these local authorities must be content that any platform that they are using is providing the level of child protection that they require, and we would expect any authority to follow the National Cybersecurity Centre's guidelines. In terms of Glow, which of course is available, last week saw over 3 million logins to Glow, and you know, many teachers and local authorities are making use of these facilities. I'll take away the point about whether Education Scotland can provide any more national guidance, but I'll end on a note of consensus. Teachers are doing a fantastic job to support young people in this very, very difficult period for them, and I want to place on record my thanks to them.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, at the commencement of lockdown in Scotland, we rightly, I believe, took a different approach to the rest of the UK in respect of the construction industry. Major employers in my constituency, such as the Robertson Construction Group, as well as other construction firms, therefore ceased operations. I know the Scottish Government are thinking very carefully about how best to ease restrictions in lockdown. So therefore, as part of that consideration, could the First Minister please tell me what the Scottish Government's current thinking is in regard to the construction industry?
First Minister.
Well, we're considering all of these matters carefully and we'll consider to do so, but the current position is unchanged, and that is that all but essential construction sites, in our view, should remain closed to help save lives and protect the health service. And I want to reiterate our thanks to the construction workers who are continuing to work on essential projects, and of course to all businesses who continue to act responsibly. That said, we are very aware that the longer lockdown continues in this very severe form, the greater the impact on industry, which is why we are putting in place unprecedented levels of support. Ministers certainly share the ambition to get businesses back to work as soon as possible, but this absolutely must be done with public health and safety as the first priority. To support this, the Local Government Housing and Planning Minister is chairing meetings of the Construction Leadership Forum, and that includes the development of safe site operating procedures. So as we go through this next process of looking at whether and when and how certain of these restrictions can be eased, the role of construction, of course, will be part of the considerations that we are making.
Murdo Fraser to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. MSPs representing rural areas will have had reports of an increase in fly tipping in the countryside over the past few weeks. This behaviour is always inexcusable, but does seem to be linked to a closure of local authority recycling and waste centres. Today, the UK Government has said that these recycling centres can reopen with appropriate social distancing put in place. Is this something the Scottish Government should also consider?
First Minister.
Of course we will consider all of that. There was a public campaign started, I think, yesterday. I'm looking at the Environment Secretary to remind me if I'm right there, around fly tipping, because we understand how unacceptable it is at any time, but also some of the factors that are perhaps contributing to that. So we'll continue to consider further action we can take to address what is an understandable concern for people.
Daniel Johnson to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While I acknowledge many have, I continue to be contacted by constituents with businesses who have yet to receive business support grants. So can I ask the First Minister, what proportion of applications have proceeded through to payment? And what measures of take-up of all eligible businesses does the Scottish Government have? And finally, what communication has the Scottish Government had with local authorities to identify and eliminate backlogs?
First Minister.
The Finance Secretary continues to have ongoing engagement with local authorities to get this money flowing as quickly as possible. This is a figure I struggled to locate in my briefing last week at FMQ, so I've made sure I've underlined it today. 33,176 business grants as of the 21st of April, so this will be updated by now, had been awarded. That amounted to more than £388 million. We continue to encourage local authorities to get those payments made as quickly as possible. We want all of the support that is being provided to be with businesses and in their bank accounts without delay. That said, of course, we have to make sure that the right processes are in place to make sure it's going to those who are eligible for it. But we continue to discuss with local authorities how they can get this money flowing as quickly as possible.
Bob Doris to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Presiding Officer, during the current COVID-19 crisis, debt, including council tax arrears, will become an increasing issue for both households and local authorities. I welcome Glasgow City Council's decision to allow households who are struggling with council tax to defer monthly payments for 2 months, as well as temporarily suspending recovery action for council tax. Will the First Minister, in partnership with COSLA, work to ensure that councils are given the support they need to support households that are struggling with council tax debt, that best practice is adopted across all local authorities, and that such best practice should ideally include full welfare advice and support to struggling households before any recovery proceedings are considered by any local authority?
First Minister.
I agree very much with the sentiment behind all of the aspects of that question. The council tax reduction scheme, of course, is in place to ensure that anybody that loses the ability to pay their council tax because they've, for example, lost their job, gets the help that they need. Over 450,000 households already receive some level of this support. Anyone whose income or earnings are impacted by the pandemic and who may now struggle to meet their next council tax payment should discuss this as soon as possible with their council, and the Scottish Government has made additional resources available to local authorities to increase the capacity of the council tax reduction scheme, given the greater demand that is likely to fall on it. We've also joined with the Scottish Citizens Advice Network to fund a new campaign to raise awareness of the financial support that is available to people. It provides information and advice on council tax, rent and mortgage payments, energy and utility bills and other financial support, and people are able to access this advice online, by phone or by contacting their local Citizens Advice Bureau. So we remain very aware of the need to ensure not just support to businesses but to support to individuals who are struggling with the impact of the measures that are in place, and will continue to consider what more we are able to do.
And Mark Ruskell.
So many charities rely on funds from the plastic bag charge, which brought in £50 million in Scotland last year. As a Parliament, we recently agreed unanimously that the charge should be temporarily suspended due to health restrictions around food deliveries. But this does, of course, mean that there's millions of pounds of lost income to charities. So does the First Minister agree that the supermarkets, who are seeing record levels of profit at the moment, should be honouring these charitable donations, even though the bag charge is currently not being collected?
First Minister.
Yes, I think that is something supermarkets should and no doubt would want to consider, and we can certainly raise that issue with supermarkets. It's also important to say that we are providing through Scottish Government resources additional support to the third sector and to charities through the Third Sector Resilience Fund, for example, and the Wellbeing Fund, which provides support to third sector organisations, including charities and social enterprises, helping them to work at the most at-risk people affected. So we will continue to do what we can to support them, but that's certainly a suggestion I'm happy to take forward.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the First Minister's questions. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 21600 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I believe Rhoda Grant may wish to speak against this motion. Rhoda Grant.
I want to speak against the business motion. The motion proposes that next week we hold Stage 1 and Stage 3 debates in this chamber. We're clear that when the Parliament meets in person, it should only be to discuss the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We cannot return to business as usual in this chamber when we're asking others only to undertake work crucial to the COVID-19 response. As I said last week, the Parliament must lead by example. The business proposed as legislation. In order for members to vote on it, they must be present in this chamber. This is disenfranchising members who must self-isolate. We propose that next week we debate the government's response to the pandemic and the way forward. This could have been a debate without motion, meaning that there would be no vote. It would have allowed time for a remote plenary session to be tested and a remote voting system to be in place to allow legislation to be passed virtually. When this is in place, we can continue the day-to-day work of the Parliament because all members will be able to take part safely from home. When the First Minister addresses her press conference and reminds people of the importance of changing their way of life to save lives and the NHS, it will have a hollow ring if she will not change her own programme for government to do the same thing. Therefore, we cannot deal with normal business until we can do so remotely in a way that is safe for all members to participate. This Parliament needs to lead by example. If we're asking others only to prioritise work regarding the pandemic, we should do that too. Until all members are able to safely take part, we should not be passing legislation. When we are forced to travel to meet physically in this Parliament, it should only be involved in the work that deals with the pandemic. And frankly, it's do as I say, not as I do, and it's wearing thin. If we don't get our act together, we actually undermine the progress made during lockdown. And if that happens, I don't believe the Scottish people would forgive us. Presiding Officer, these are points I made last week, and sadly, the other parties in this chamber apparently do not share our concerns. Therefore, we must move against the business motion tonight.
Thank you very much, Ms Grant. Can I call on Graham Day, Minister for Parliamentary Business, to respond?
Presiding Officer, as you know all too well, the unprecedented times we're in have, amongst other things, posed this Parliament a series of challenges around how it meets and how it finds ways of effectively scrutinising the government. I believe, the majority of opposition parties in this institution would acknowledge that the Scottish Government has been a willing participant in facilitating that scrutiny, whether it be in plenary sessions, virtual sessions, sittings of established committees, or the establishment of a special COVID-19 committee. But this Parliament is also this nation's legislature, and like other parliaments, it has to find a balance between continuing to facilitate appropriate levels of coronavirus consideration and progressing legislation which is already on the agenda of its committees or is anticipated to be so. I note, Presiding Officer, that the UK Parliament is this week considering the domestic abuse and fire safety bills, and I read that Labour is bringing forward amendments to the former. So we are here in this place not alone in seeking to demonstrate that, as well as addressing the very urgent COVID-19 matters which are occupying our thoughts, we are progressing other issues, whilst practising social distancing, utilising remote means of scrutiny and having Parliament staff actively seeking online voting solutions. And given Labour's active participation in the domestic abuse bill going through Westminster today, and Alec Rowley's call earlier this afternoon for the very COVID-related debate which this business programme schedules, there are, I'm sure, many in this chamber who are somewhat baffled by their opposition to the motion. Presiding Officer, the programme which the Bureau, by clear majority, approved today strikes the balance I noted earlier, as well as seeking to bring a degree of routine back into the sitting patterns of this Parliament. A fortnight today, under the proposals approved by the Bureau, we will spend an afternoon in a debate titled Suppressing COVID, the Next Phase, which will afford members from all sides the opportunity to offer their thoughts on this important subject. As Minister for Parliamentary Business, I can further advise the Chamber that the Government will seek Bureau approval shortly to dedicate 2 afternoons the following week to conducting Stage 1 and then Stage 3 of the second coronavirus bill. Between these debates and bill stages, not to mention First Minister's questions, topical questions, statements, virtual questions, members will have ample opportunity over the coming weeks to focus attention on the pandemic. But it is right that this Parliament also demonstrates to the country that, having adapted its approaches to conducting business and with a collective will, it can take forward some of the normal business of a Parliament. And on that basis, Presiding Officer, and on behalf of the Bureau, I invite members to support the business programme.
Thank you very much. We'll go straight to the question. The question is that motion 21600 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on motion 21600, and members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 21600 in the name of Graham Day is yes 54, no 15. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item is consideration of business motions 21595 and 21596 on the extension of a stage 1 timetable for 2 bills. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move these motions?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And again, no member has indicated they wish to speak on these motions. The question therefore is that motions 21595 and 21596 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of 3 SSIs. Could I call on Graham Day to move motions 21584, 21585 and 21586 on approval of an SSI?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And so there's one question today. I propose to ask a single question, that is. Does anyone object if I ask a single question on 3 SSIs? No. Okay, so the question is that motions 21584, 21585 and 21586 in the name of Graham Day be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that concludes decision time. Point of order on Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm not intending to expand the conversation about the Business Bureau motions. I think that's between the business managers. Just looking for some guidance from yourself. The sense that I get from ministers when we're questioning in the chamber is that they're more than happy to answer the questions and to come to the Parliament to answer important questions that people have. And the sense I also get from members is that they travel through to the Parliament with an inbox that is crammed with people raising concerns, whether it be about employee concerns, employer concerns, frontline medical staff concerned about PPE, or even general members of the public wanting to know what's going to happen in future. I don't think it's an unrealistic expectation to ask the Parliament to consider how we conduct the business in terms of the strict timetabling of each individual statement and then the expansion of where we get to decision time. If a member chooses to leave their home, to break what is the natural rules we are setting for the general public, to come to this Parliament one day a week to ask a question that is relevant to the response to COVID-19, I think every effort should be made for that member to get to ask that question and for ministers to get the opportunity to answer that question. And I just wonder what can be done in terms of the timetabling of individual statements and indeed then any ministerial questions so people can have that opportunity. Is it to, for example, expand the debate without notice for 30 minutes if there are individual questions, just so we don't have a sense of frustration that people are coming through to this Parliament to ask a very, very serious question and not get the opportunity to have that question answered, like I'm sure ministers themselves will be frustrated that they're not able to answer questions within the Parliament.
Can I thank Mr Sarwar for that point, and can I say I utterly recognise what he is saying, and in fact I was consulting with Chief Executive about writing to all MSPs today to address that very issue. It was an issue in fact raised by Mr Kelly earlier today, in fact by Mr Kelly last week as well. I recognise members make a big effort to come along, and not even to be able to ask a 15-second question is a source of enormous frustration. The Bureau is responsible, that is, the political parties voted by all members is responsible for allocating time. However, we are working on a reduced timetable, so the Bureau, that is, every member here, has agreed that we're only going to meet in person one day a week. Now that severely restricts the number of opportunities for members to ask questions. Within that, I think there are some steps we can take. For example, today and last week, we extended decision time by 15 minutes, recognising that to extend business without notifying members or the public is not something we take lightly, because it's very inconvenient for very many people, not least broadcasters, apart from anything else. However, we are looking at further steps, including, for example, this is a very serious subject. The questions tend to be slightly longer, the answers slightly longer, because it's a more sombre subject. And I think we should adjust perhaps our speaking times and statements to adjust for that fact. We are looking for other steps we can take. Perhaps there's more use to be made of the online, the virtual remote questioning. But there's only a limited amount of time, reduced time that we are allocating, and therefore there is a lot of frustration. But can I say to Mr Sarwar and to all members, Mr Sarwar and Mr Kelly are not the only ones, Mr Tompkins raised this with me today, and other members too, in a second, Mr Crawford. And so I recognise absolutely the frustration that is expressed, and we are trying to address it. Mr Crawford.
I certainly, thank you very much. I certainly very much appreciate the comments made by Anna Sarwar and yourself, Presiding Officer. But there's also a job to be done here by party managers, because some members were able to ask 3 questions today, where other members within the same party were not able to ask any questions at all. So it's not just about how the parliamentary authorities go about it, it's also about how the party managers arrange for the questions to be asked.
Thank you, Mr Crawford. Thank you, Mr Crawford. That point was not wasted on me either. I also noted that today. Mr Findlay.
Thanks, President Officer. I think people are raising very legitimate concerns. I think no one doubts the pressure that the government is working under at this time, no one, or at any other public agencies. But what exacerbates the frustration, and this is perfectly understandable why, but is the length of time it's taken to get answers back on a whole range of issues from a whole range of different organisations. So if we combine that with the limited opportunities that Parliament's got, we end up exacerbating the frustration even more. And we've got, every one of us has people back in our constituencies who are saying to us, I asked you a question 4 weeks ago and I've not got the answer. So I wonder if you, with the business managers and the government, could look at all of these issues and try and address some of them, because it's all of that that's building up the frustration.
Again, I would say to Mr Findlay that that point is widely recognised, not just in opposition parties, but by the government, who have put in place a number of procedures themselves. The Parliament also recently, the Chamber Desk, established a particular service which puts together every single COVID-related question, which is now available on the website. it may not help the member to know this, but there are a lot of questions are submitted which have already been submitted by other members and answers, but in all the information it's difficult to find these. The Parliament is now providing a service in addition to that which is already available through question and answers. So that service is there. However, the underlying frustration is one that I think is shared amongst all members. There is a limited amount of time. All members want to get their points on the record on behalf of their constituents, and there's not an opportunity for every member to contribute every single week. But we are trying, and I will take all these points on board and work with parliamentary authorities, and particularly with the business managers, to try and address these issues, if that circle can be squared. One question, sorry. So I would just ask the First Minister to make a contribution.
I hope this is helpful, President Officer. It's certainly intended in that spirit. Could I say, first of all, in relation to a comment that was made earlier on, parliamentary business is not for the government to decide. It is certainly not for me as First Minister to decide. But if it is helpful, I am more than happy to have First Minister's question sessions right now, given the uniqueness of the circumstances we're in, that continue until such time as everybody who wants to ask a question has asked that question. Obviously, that has to be timetabled in a way that fits with other parliamentary business, but I have no objection to that, and if that's something the Bureau wants to consider, that would be absolutely acceptable to me.
Thank you. I think from the reaction, you can judge that was very well received and will be acted upon. Mr Macmillan, are you still wishing to make a point of order?
Yeah, thank you, President Officer. Just want to raise a point that the Chamber starts at 2 p.m. If we can start the Chamber at an earlier period of time, bearing in mind we're already here, then that might actually assist instead of people actually staying here a bit longer. Thank you.
Okay, all these points have been noted. The general frustration is absolutely noted and was aware to us for some time, and we've been trying to work on this. However, we will try to address it. I would note we have one virtual session this week on local government, and there will also be 2 days to meet next week. All these points will be noted. So on that note, can I say thank you very much, and I close this meeting.